So, in my opinion, asparagus is really the quintessential springtime vegetable, and when it's in season, I am constantly looking for new and interesting ways to cook with it. These 4 recipes really highlight the versatility of asparagus and are great vegetable side dish options depending on what it is you're serving. They range in difficulty, but no recipe will take you longer than 15 minutes in total, and a lot of that time can be inactive. And if you're new here, I'm Maggie. This is No Frills Kitchen, where I teach you how to cook with confidence with nothing fancy required.
So the first step for all of these recipes is to prep the asparagus. This is pretty simple and minimalistic. I don't like to do too much. Simply trim the thick woody ends off of the asparagus. You can save the scraps for making stock later. I just like to chuck them in the freezer. If some of the ends are still a bit thick and woody, go ahead and use a vegetable peeler to shave off a thin layer of the skin. This will make it nice and tender when cooked. And that's it with the asparagus. Okay, let's move on to the easiest of these recipes, just a simple sauteed asparagus with garlic and lemon. Set a skillet over medium-high heat and add enough olive oil to coat the pan. Once the oil is shimmering, toss in your asparagus along with a generous pinch of salt. I like to use coarse sea salt when cooking. If I was in America, I would be using kosher salt, but I've never seen that outside of the USA. Generally, a generous pinch, in my book, ends up weighing about 1 to 2 grams or about a quarter teaspoon. I also find that it's better to season early and often just to ensure everything is properly seasoned throughout. This is especially important in such a simple recipe with so few ingredients, and it's really a fundamental to really elevate your cooking. Cook the asparagus, tossing frequently until it's bright green, starting to brown, and beginning to get a bit tender. This should only be a minute or 2. Then grate over some lemon zest, a clove of garlic, and add in an optional pinch of red chili flakes. To be honest, there are a few flavor combinations finer than lemon and garlic, and I find that the addition of the zest really amplifies the lemoniness without adding any extra effort really. Toss this until fragrant and pour over a bit of lemon juice. Toss just to coat and then turn off the heat and serve. Now on to a super simple roasted asparagus recipe. This one requires next to no prep. First, we're going to preheat the oven to 190°C 375F and also crush a few cloves of garlic with the flat side of your knife. Once the cloves are crushed, it's also super easy to pop the clove right out of the peel. I usually don't bother to cut off the root end either, as it gets nice and tender when cooked anyway. Arrange your asparagus on a baking sheet and add your crushed garlic. Drizzle over some olive oil, season with salt and pepper, and then add a splash of balsamic vinegar. Toss everything until it's evenly coated and then move to the oven. You don't really need to use exact measurements here, just eyeball it. Roast the asparagus for 10 to 12 minutes or until it's tender but still crisp and beginning to brown. If you're nervous or are unsure of your oven temperature, then make sure to check the asparagus at around the 8-minute mark just to ensure that you haven't taken it too far. Once it reaches this stage, you're ready to serve. Okay, on to the slightly more elevated recipes. This one is another roasted option, but I promise it's still super simple. So keep the oven at the same 190°C 375F temperature. Now, in a small bowl, add 25 grams of Panko breadcrumbs. Then grate in 10 grams of Parmesan cheese and grate in a clove of garlic. I like to use a rasp-style grater when grating in the cheese just because I think the texture it comes out with is much nicer than if you use like a box grater or something like that. Finally, chop up some fresh parsley and some fresh oregano and add it to the bowl as well. Season it with salt and pepper and stir it with a fork to combine. If you can't find fresh oregano for whatever reason, then go ahead and use dried. Just make sure to reduce the quantity you add in, maybe just a quarter or half teaspoon. I absolutely love fresh oregano and I think it's a really underrated herb. It also does have a slightly more floral and less pungent flavor than the dried version, so I really recommend trying to use fresh if you have it. Now, arrange your asparagus on a baking sheet and drizzle with a bit of olive oil. Season with a generous pinch of salt and toss it evenly to coat. Then sprinkle the crumb mixture evenly over the asparagus. I didn't end up using all of the crumbs, but I can find a use for them for something else later. This is really just because I'm not cooking a huge amount of asparagus for each of these dishes because quite frankly, there's only 2 of us and there's only so much asparagus we can eat. Roast the asparagus for about 10 to 12 minutes, just until the breadcrumbs get all toasty and browned and the asparagus is tender yet still crisp. This recipe is great as a vegetable side for lots of different Italian dishes or something with more mild European flavors. Okay, let's move on to the final recipe. Frankly, I think this is my favorite one, and it's such a good side dish to serve with some more Asian-inspired flavors. In a small bowl, combine 1 tablespoon of oyster sauce, 2 teaspoons of toasted sesame oil, 2 teaspoons of rice wine vinegar, 1 teaspoon of maple syrup, you can also use honey here, a spoonful of sesame seeds, and a generous pinch of chili flakes. Then grate in a clove of garlic and give this a quick mix with a fork just to make sure everything is well combined. Now, onto the stovetop, set a skillet over medium-high heat and cover with some oil. Once shimmering, add your asparagus and a generous pinch of salt. You don't need to use as much salt as you would for the first recipe, however, as the oyster sauce is really quite salty already. The salt here is more just to ensure that the asparagus gets evenly seasoned before adding the glaze we just made. Like in the first recipe, we're going to toss and cook this just until it turns a bright green and begins to soften just a bit. This should only take a couple of minutes. Your goal with all of these recipes is to ensure that the asparagus is tender yet still crisp and offers some bite. There's nothing worse, in my opinion, than soft, overcooked asparagus. Once you've reached the desired stage, pour over your glaze. Toss the asparagus to ensure everything is evenly coated and the sauce becomes sticky and really clings to the vegetables. The combination of toasted sesame oil and oyster sauce really gives it a craveable, savory quality that I honestly just love. Okay, so just cook this for a couple of minutes longer and then you'll be ready to eat. And in the meantime, let me know which of these recipes you're looking to try, or if you have any unique ways you like cooking asparagus. Enjoy!